So I recommend doing some shakes because I want you to hear all of this. And so we don't want the after lunch lulls to get us. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Camille Crittenden, who serves as Deputy Director of Citrus and the Benato Group. She's very cool. I just had the pleasure of meeting her right now, and I'm really happy to be introducing her. She's not only the co-founder of the Citrus Policy Lab, but she's also the co-founder of the Women in Technology Initiative at the UC system. And prior to joining Citrus, she was the executive director of the Human Rights Center at Berkeley Law. And she is very cool. So I'm going to introduce her without further ado. So can everybody give her a warm welcome? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Melissa. And thanks to everyone for sticking it out after lunch. I'm really happy to be here and excited to share with you some of the insights I've found over the last couple of months since writing the short abstract. You know how it goes. If you write the abstract and it gets accepted, then you have to actually write the paper. So it's been very interesting to look into some of this research, a lot of which will be familiar to many of you. It's been really great to be here over the last day and a half and hear from folks who are working in the libraries and working out in the communities and really already have a good understanding of some of the context of what I would like to present today. Maybe someone wants to Skype in. And so what I wanted to talk about is really to look at this intersection of the maybe unexpected benefits of broadband access. I think that we all know the general outlines of why broadband is essential and beneficial for kids, but there might be some things that we haven't yet considered, and especially for underserved youth. So just to say, this is basically what I'd like to talk with you about in the next half hour or so. To give you a little bit of an overview of who else is looking at this area, what do I mean by underserved, and then to think a little bit more about what are teens doing online, and what are some of the unexpected benefits in some of these areas around health, education, economic development, and civic engagement, and then to provide a few recommendations for educators, policymakers, and others working in this area. So you might already be familiar with some of these anthropologists or sociologists who are really looking at what youth are doing when they're online. This is a field that's grown up in the last 2 decades or so. And many of them actually work here in Southern California. Mimi Ito, the book on the right there is at UC Irvine. Jean Twenge is actually at San Diego State. And there are a few others you might be familiar with. Sherry Turkle's work at MIT. When I put together this list of some of the writers that I had been reading and thinking about, I noticed, what do you notice about this list? They're all women. Yes. So we need to increase, on the one hand, go women, but on the other hand, we need to increase diversity. Like men should also be concerned about what kids are doing online, right? So in addition to the independent researchers, we also have think tanks and organizations, and you'll be familiar with many of these already. The Pew Research Center, Common Sense Media has a research arm that's doing some work on this area as well. So thinking about who is underserved, we've talked a lot about rural and tribal communities already today, those coming from low socioeconomic households, and those where maybe the parents are of lower educational attainment. And when I say youth, I'm talking about really teens up through, maybe college age, so roughly 13 to 24 years old. So looking at access to broadband, this statistic won't surprise anyone in the room probably about the number of people who lack access to broadband and where they are. So the graph on the right is a little bit backwards in the way to read it. It is the percentage of Americans who lack access to broadband, which is higher among rural and tribal communities than it is in the urban areas, which is farther there on the left-hand bar. And I think the statistic came up earlier, about 13% of the US population is considered rural. So it's not just access to broadband, but it's also access to devices. And this was from a study that ACT did in 2017, so just a couple years ago. And this is also a little bit funny the way it's written, but I want to call your attention when they say access to one device, they mean only one device. And that is usually the device that's at home and for the blue bar. And the yellow is the access only to a smartphone. So you'll see in the rural areas that those numbers are much higher than for the other populations. So really limited access to the devices themselves. So the good news is that nearly all US teens now have access to a smartphone, something like 95% of teens. So I'll show a graph in just a minute with that detail. The access to a laptop or a desktop at home varies somewhat by income level and by educational attainment of the parents. And roughly half of all teens say they use their phones constantly. Girls slightly more than boys, and Hispanic teens slightly higher than whites. So this comes from the Pew study that I referenced earlier. And here's some of this information just in graph form. So you'll see that there's not that much disparity actually among the different demographic groups, except for the access to a desktop or laptop for lower income households, and also somewhat for the parents' level of educational attainment is somewhat lower. So why do we care? Like, why is this important? Just to articulate a few points about this. The advantages of being online. You have the persistence of material and content that's available online. You have visibility, so more people can actually see and collectively witness what they're seeing on the internet. It can be shared, for better or for worse. It is easily spreadable, and it's also searchable. So this work outlined also comes from Dana Boyd, whose work I would really recommend. She wrote this book, It's Complicated. Now, a few years ago, she's a researcher with Microsoft Research, but she's done really good ethnographic kind of work around youth and online behavior. So what are kids doing online? They're doing homework. We talked a lot about the access gap, and that it's really necessary to have both the devices and the network connections to do homework. They're working, doing social media, various social media platforms whose popularity come and goes, but those are some of the popular ones. Video games, of course, we talked about the library access to video games, and for those who can, to play at home. Communications, they're texting, they're Skyping with their grandparents or with, their friends, spending time face-to-face, but via this interface. They're creating, they're making their own videos, and they're collaboratively doing things online together. And then there's also more the kind of professional, quasi-personal development of looking for jobs, maybe taking online courses, applying for financial aid, things like that. So it's hard to say, we need to limit screen time. Like, that's a very blunt instrument when kids are doing all of these things, some of which are quite worthwhile, some more than others. But when you say, you only get X minutes or hours or whatever of screen time, that's a little bit hard to mediate what exactly that means. So why do we care? What are some of the risks of being online? Excessive use, if you're only online and not actually having a life in person with anyone, that can be detrimental. There are content risks, so what are kids going to come across? And there have been scares in the news recently around some violent material that kids might come across unexpectedly that shouldn't be allowed for viewers under the age of 13 or other parameters. Conduct risks, if you're engaging in bullying or engaging in these kind of teasing or antisocial behaviors, that's a risk. If you are the victim of those kind of interactions, that's also a risk. And then finally, there's the risk of commercial exploitation. So if someone gets your private information as a kid, and there have been recent lawsuits and fines. You might have read about the TikTok fine that was imposed recently for this app that used to be called Musical.ly, where the organization was fined for getting information about kids who are using the app who are under the age of 13. So this, just to point out sort of how these platforms come in and out of favor. You would think that Facebook has been on this, kind of perennial growth curve. But as I came to understand, this slide is really mostly about Facebook and the differences in these demographic groups that favor one platform or over another. And it made me think, well, this kind of socio-dynamics of the lunchroom is being played out online in some ways, where teens are self-segregating into certain platforms. So Facebook is used more by teens in lower socioeconomic households. Black teens more than whites say that Facebook is their most used site, and that's by a pretty stark difference, 26% of Black kids versus others. And then just to say that these preferred platforms shift relatively quickly. The graph on the right shows the difference as far as the income groups that favor Facebook over other platforms, and the lower socioeconomic households tend to favor Facebook. But my favorite quote when I was looking this up said, one teen, when asked during a focus group session who she still talks to on Facebook, replied, "My grandparents," which made me startle a little bit. So despite these alarmist kind of stories to the contrary, the self-reported effects of social media are mostly positive, and this also comes from a Pew study. They feel like they're more connected. It helps them, they think, have interactions with a more diverse group of friends, and feel like they have friends online who would help to support them. I think we hear more about teens who have this kind of fear of missing out or fear of comparing themselves to their friends' glamorous projections of their lives online, and that happens to some extent. But it seems like generally teens feel fairly positive about their social media use. But this can also be nuanced a little bit. And some researchers have found this digital Goldilocks effect, which I thought was a nice way to put it, that there is sort of this peak of, a somewhat limited level of engagement online when it actually makes teens, or they were looking specifically at teens, makes teens feel better. But then with this longer persistent use, once you get into 5, 6, 7 hours a day, that sense of well-being declines. So the graph here just shows these different activities, and it doesn't vary that much by the activity. It's more kind of the overall time being online between watching TV and movies, playing video games, using computers, and using smartphones. So I think the warnings and the sort of dire stories about teens being encouraged toward violence, either toward others or toward themselves, are more on the kind of right-hand side of those curves if they're online quite a bit. So let me turn now to some of these unanticipated benefits that I came across when I was looking into this. So we're going to look at health, at education, economic development, and at civic engagement. So there was an interesting study done by Hope Lab, which is a group based in Redwood City in the Bay Area, that did a survey of youth around their health practices related to being online. And so these were some of the activities related to health that teens reported. So these are 14 to 22-year-olds. They go online for information, use mobile apps, etc. So in addition to these, they were also investigating the effect of being online for teens who are moderately to severely depressed, and found many of them said that social media is very important for them to express themselves creatively, to get inspiration from others, and to feel less alone. 30% of them said they felt less alone being online. And they also preferred communicating with people through social media than in person, which you can understand. 42% agreed with that statement. So even the health-seeking behavior differs somewhat by age, and so the older cohort in this group are more likely to go online to look for health information. And many of them have, as you can see, 94% of those in that 18 to 22-year-old age group say they've gone online to look for health information. And they're mostly looking for information around pregnancy and birth control, depression, stress, and anxiety, some of the topics that you might expect. So that also kind of suggests some differences by gender as well. And so 91% of teens and young adult females say they've gone online versus 83% of males looking for health information. And the young women are looking for information about birth control and pregnancy. Also anxiety and depression. So there was an interesting different gender difference in what kind of health information young people are looking for. And I thought this slide was also informative. This is also from that Hope Lab report that I mentioned by sexual orientation. So the darker bar is LGBTQ youth, looking for many more of them, looking for information about depression, anxiety, stress, etc. So the internet can provide a good community and source of information for others who might feel inhibited about seeking that information in other places that could be more public. So this was the question that really got me thinking about this whole topic. Did anyone else read this article in The Atlantic about the sex recession? It was so fascinating. I recommend the whole article, and one or two little lines in there got me thinking about this topic, because they cited a few studies that showed the effect of broadband on reproductive choice. So this 2017 study asked, can broadband internet be seen as an engine of liberation that allows individuals to realize fertility desires and to combine work and family? And they found this twofold effect. They found a positive effect of high-speed internet availability for women who are 25 and above. And usually that meant the positive effect being that they wanted to have another child and were trying to figure out how to do that. And usually it was a second child. And what they posit in this study is that by having high-speed internet, that the family, usually, the young mother, could figure out better how to manage her life and, perhaps a career family balance by having access to high-speed internet. And on the other hand, for the access to information on the risks and costs of early pregnancy and childbearing may explain the negative effect or lower fertility on young people. So I thought that this was really an interesting finding. And then it made me look at how much the US spends on abstinence-only sex education, and thought that $250 million might be better spent on broadband proliferation. So at the same time, there's been this really tremendous decline in the US teen birth rate. I don't know if you're aware of this. This graph just goes from 1940s, we all know it spiked really in the 1950s in the post-war generation, and then it had gradually declined to 2009. And this comes from the CDC. I went and looked, so 2009 was over 10 years ago, and more recent statistics say that the birth rate now is even half of what it was then. So it's been this really dramatic decline in the teen birth rate. And so there's this correlation, if not causation, and adoption of broadband internet and activities online, social media, and all of that. And even if you wanted to just take a purely economic view rather than the impact on families and young women especially, between 1991 and 2015, the teen birth rate dropped 64%, which resulted in $4.4 billion in public savings in 2015 alone. So thinking about it as a public health issue is one way to consider in thinking about the health economics of broadband and health. So here's another really startling, this was a different study, this is from 2015, and the people who were running it said, our results suggest that increased broadband access explains at least 13% of the decline in the teen birth rate between 1999 and 2007. So why would that be? And they looked into that as well and said, teens these days and, recent days tend to stay home and be online. If they have good access to internet, they can stay home and watch movies, they can talk to their friends online, they can play video games online. They don't have to actually be together in person. And there's this kind of incarceration effect where they're self-selecting to stay home. And then there's also the lower barriers to contraception, as we saw earlier. So, you can't attribute entirely the decline in teen fertility to broadband. Some other possible effects that were noted were an MTV reality show from 2009 called 16 and Pregnant. That perhaps they say this in other shows like Teen Mom and Teen Mom 2, apparently there's a sequel, explained 1/3 of decline in births through 2010. So the effect of media, but including internet on teen birth rates, I thought was really surprising and very interesting. So I wanted to go back and with all kinds of caveats about what the mapping means, and I think this really bears further research, and I would be very interested to see if someone wanted to kind of match up more of the nuance around who has access to broadband and where, what the impact is then on teen fertility. This map shows the change in the birth rate for women aged 15 to 17 between 2007 and 2009. And West Virginia, which has crummy broadband, as we all know, probably the third worst in the country, I think, it was the only state that had an increase in teen fertility. So this was several years ago. There are probably many confounding factors, but still it's provocative, right? So other possible health effects of teens being online. There has been a decline in obesity, and some people say that paradoxically, it could be because of this activity with video games, that as opposed to sitting at the television and mindlessly, passively watching entertainment, that you're active and your hands are busy, and it makes it less easy to snack and to eat while you're doing this activity. Also, you are less frequently exposed to advertisements around unhealthy foods. At the same time, there has been an increase in teen suicide, and Jean Twenge, who is one of the researchers I mentioned at the front, has noted this, that between 2010 and 2015, teen suicide attempts increased 33% among that teenage group. And she did a good job as a social scientist to rule out what the other confounding factors might be. So it's not due to unemployment or to stronger homework expectations, but she at least is positing that it could be in part due to this increased use of social media. So there are other health effects, in part because teens tend to party less. They're not like in the 80s going to friends' houses and hanging out and drinking and whatnot. They're staying home, so there's less drunk driving incidents among teens. That has declined, but texting, like distracted driving, continues to be an issue. However, teens tend to do it slightly less than their parents do, their research shows. So let that be a lesson to us all. So turning now to education, and this is where you all, I know, have much deeper experience than I do, but of course, these are some of the activities that we all know folks need broadband for in the educational context. So even within the school day or within the school context, for curriculum, for supplementary materials, and for teacher development. I came across this, I think it's about a 20-minute documentary that I would really recommend. It was directed by Rory Kennedy. It was sponsored by Verizon, which makes me a little suspicious, but just to say that, to have that commercial backing, of course, we're going to be boosterish about needing to have the broadband access, but I think the documentary really did a good job of trying to make the connection between the need for devices, for connections, and for teacher training. So take a look at that. The title of the talk was all about unexpected benefits of broadband access, but here is another unexpected benefit, perhaps, of global warming. I don't know if you saw this story about how Alaska schools are now able to get faster internet connections because the ice is melting. They're able to lay fiber in places where they hadn't been able to before. So I thought that was a striking story as well. And this was Quintillion, I think was the name of the company that was doing it. They laid 1,200 miles of fiber optic cable along the Alaska coast. And that meant huge gains for the Alaska schools, which had something like 130,000 students, that now they were able to get this kind of video access to instructional materials and to be able to communicate with students in classrooms across the country where they hadn't been able to before. So many of you are aware or actually involved in a lot of these advocacy efforts for getting broadband into schools. The California Rural Education Network was launched just last year. Future Ready Schools, the Education Superhighway. There's an article in the Chronicle of Philanthropy recently about Evan Marwell and his efforts to get Wi-Fi into the districts all across the country. And then finally, the E-rate program, which many of you are well familiar with. So beyond the classroom, though, students also need broadband these days for test prep, for taking SATs, ACTs, and the Khan Academy teamed up with the College Board, which provides the SAT, to help get teens more ready access to preparing for that. So I thought I would just share the results of the SATs from last year, and you'll notice it's a little bit hard to read, but where I have boxed, those are the benchmarks met, and you'll see that the lowest percentage of benchmarks met are in the more typically disadvantaged communities like American Indians and Hispanics, Black and African Americans don't reach the levels that especially Asian Americans do, or also white students. So it won't surprise you that those demographic groups line up pretty well with those who have or don't have access to broadband and computers. So I just wanted to put those charts up as points of comparison. Thinking about economic opportunity, access to broadband can bring benefits, of course, for looking for jobs, for applying for jobs. For teens, there's not that much that they can actually do for employment online. They tend to be more, mowing the lawn or working in retail or things like that actually require you to be there. However, in some underserved communities, there was an organization that we recognized through the Women in Tech initiative called Code to Inspire that's based in Afghanistan, where young women of high school and college age are learning coding skills. And in that way, in a somewhat repressive community, they're able to go to a place where they're all women and still contribute to their families' livelihoods and learn about coding and progress intellectually themselves as well. I was struck by this headline from the San Francisco Chronicle a couple of weeks ago as well. And we think about, being online as being a luxury, or the kids are just doing social media or playing games, but it can really be an important lifeline for the young and homeless. So it's a way for them to gain access to information around services that they can avail themselves of. And also, again, the social workers don't really mind if they just stay in the youth facility and watch movies, because that way at least they're not out on the street or being at risk for other kind of harmful behaviors. Looking at civic engagement, again, I worked on a project earlier in my career called Data and Democracy, where we were somewhat skeptical about, this is, maybe 7-8 years ago, when people started becoming active online, that there was this phenomenon of clicktivism, where you feel like, okay, I've signed a petition online, I've done something, and then it wouldn't actually translate into offline engagement. But researchers have found that that's not actually true, that being online and taking part in political activities online actually does translate, at least among the youth, into being more active in political engagement offline as well. So for future study, for future presentations, I'm very curious too about some of these creative pursuits that youth are doing online. So just to turn for a quick minute to the parenting side, how many of you are parents? How many of you are parents of teenagers? Some. How many of you start many sentences with, would you put your phone down and? I do. So there are some battles over screen time, but there's a benefit for the parents too, and especially for those who might be in communities where they wouldn't necessarily find ready offline communities, especially maybe in rural areas or other underserved areas. And internet may reduce social isolation. If you have kids who are very young, actually, and you're home all day with your child, it can be a necessary lifeline for parents too, to have some other source of social engagement. So just a few recommendations before I wrap up. Thinking about the policy side, we have folks who work with policymakers or are policymakers to really make that a commitment. We talked about the relative advantages or disadvantages of the 5G rollout that's coming. But to think about that as, just exacerbating the digital divide. And we'll probably always have some sort of digital divide, but to figure out how we can ameliorate that to the extent possible. And thinking about other legislation like the Farm Bill that we can add investment in for broadband access. Looking at industry and nonprofit orgs, partnerships, which many of you are already doing, but I really encourage those kinds of connections. And for teachers to be aware of those disparities in access, not only to devices, but to network connections and when you're making assignments and such. And I know that many of us are already trying to deal with that. Serve as knowledgeable advocates. And I wanted to point out this one legal suit that I thought was so interesting. It came up in 2013 when the New York City Teachers Union was successfully able to sue for overtime and back pay because of poor internet connection, that they were required to do so much testing and form filling and such, and the connection was so bad that they had to sit there and watch the spinner go around, that they were able to actually get a $41 million settlement because of this, which I thought was fascinating. Okay, so finally, for our parents, if you have read Michael Pollan's books recently, he advocates around food, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. So this is sort of a modification of this to use screens, not too much and mostly together if you talk with your teen about how they're using their phones or their screens. As parents and as adults, role models for everyone, we need to be good role models and to pay attention, but it doesn't rise to the level of panic for what teens are doing online. And those are my comments. Thank you. I would be happy to take questions. I don't know if we have any time remaining.
There's a big movement in the K-8 space right now called Wait Until 8th. Don't give a cell phone to a kid until they're in 8th grade because it causes more of a distraction than a benefit. What would you say to parents, et cetera, for, 6th, 7th graders wanting a cell phone, et cetera? Is there any research behind that to back that up?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I would be interested to see that. The group that I was looking at mostly was, 8th grade and above. So I didn't see necessarily, but I think, the cell phone, I personally just think that's a reasonable recommendation, that there are educational apps and things like that kids can use. So it really depends on the context, I think, and the parents' availability. I would say that I would point to the use screens together aphorism there, and some of the research that I saw said it's hard to, the American Academy of Pediatricians, I think at one point had a very strict kind of limit as to how much screen time they were recommending, like none for kids under 2 and then a half hour a day or something like that. They might have walked that back a little bit by now, but I think that research says that if the parents are more engaged with the kid, it's kind of like watching television, asking questions and having it be more of a conversational thing to prompt education rather than as a babysitter, which is the more typical use and easier.
Hi, Camille. You mentioned an interest in doing some ongoing research in kind of how kids are creating and things on these platforms. What are some research directions that you'd like the community to look at?
Yeah, well, I think these collaboration platforms are really interesting. So Instagram or YouTube, the Musical.ly app where kids do these kind of voiceovers to popular songs or skits. That's fascinating. And then that they want to record themselves, I think is also fascinating, and post that online. So I think the collaboration aspect is really interesting. And then just how kids are looking at themselves and looking at the media and translating that into creating their online presence at young ages. But I think there's a lot to look at there.
Well, that's all the time we have for now. Let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you.